Good afternoon, everyone. So today's panel session is cybersecurity, culture and remote working. In a minute, I'll be handing over to security journalist Stephen Pritchard. He'll be leading the panel and moderating. I've just got a couple of reminders for you. Please use the polls function on the right of your viewing pane to ask questions. Also note, during this session, the panel have got some questions and polls to ask you. So please get involved and answer those questions so we can have a bit more of an interactive session. If you haven't already, you can click on the theatre mode button under your viewing pane, which will allow you to see everybody in full screen, which is just what we want. Okay, so that's all from me. I'm just going to hand right over now to Stephen.
Fantastic, Kerry, thank you very much. So hello and welcome back to Cybersecurity Live, and this session is going to be on cybersecurity and remote working. As Kerry's already said, my name is Stephen Pritchard. I'm a security journalist and a broadcaster. So over the last 6 months, we have seen a huge change, or more than 6 months now, a huge change in the way that people are working, and businesses have had to move very rapidly to set up remote and home working technology. And generally speaking, the consensus is, from a practical point of view, that's been a success, even though a lot of people have been working from home for the first time, and potentially in job roles that weren't designed with that in mind. The question is, though, what is the impact going to be on security, and in particular on cybersecurity culture? And that is all the more important if, as it seems likely in a lot of businesses, that the move towards home working is going to be permanent. Maybe not permanent for all time, but certainly permanent for some people indefinitely, and a long-term option for others. So that's what we're going to look at. We're going to address some of the questions that arises from that change, and potentially what we've learned over the last 6 to 9 months during a lockdown and during this need to re-engineer a lot of our business processes, but particularly the role that cybersecurity and cybersecurity culture is going to play in ensuring that we protect data and protect systems from bad actors. So what we'll do is discuss this as a panel. I'll introduce the panel in a moment, but we've got some good expertise here. That will take about half an hour or so, and then I will open up to questions from the floor, which Kerry will introduce on the screen there. So if you keep that open. We'll also have some poll questions, and what we'll do is ideally come to those at various points in the session. I think they're probably already live on your screen now, actually, but in any case, we'll look at the results from those either as they come along or towards the end of the session. So you don't necessarily need to fill them all in now, but certainly if you could fill them in before the end of the half an hour, that would be great. And say we've got about 10 minutes left for Q&A at the end. Okay, so I'll move on now and introduce our panel. So joining us, we have Holly Grace Williams from Secarma, where she is the Managing Director, Phil Jackman, who is the Director of Cyber North and Vice Chair of Dynamo Northeast, and Andy Bates, Executive Director for the UK, Middle East and India, if I've got all those geographies right, Andy, at the Global Cyber Alliance. So what I'm going to do is just to kick off, if I could just, starting with Holly, ask each of the panelists to just tell us a little bit about themselves and their background in cybersecurity before we go into the depth of the content around cybersecurity culture. So Holly, over to you.
Hi, my name's Holly Grace Williams. I used to introduce myself in a really interesting way by saying I break into computers and buildings for a living. However, recently I've become the managing director at Secarma. So now it's a little bit more about business strategy than it is ethical hacking. But that's my background, ethical hacking, or penetration testing as we know it in.
Phil?
Hi, my name is Phil Jackman. I have 25 years in senior management experience, senior IT management experience in the private and public sector. For the last 3 years, though, I've been running Cyber North, which is the Northeast Digital Cybersecurity Cluster. I'm not really a cybersecurity expert, though, so that's another story how I managed to end up here.
Well, you've got plenty of expertise that we can bring to bear on this panel. Andy, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Thanks, Stephen. So Andy Bates, Executive Director of Global Cyber Alliance. If you've not heard of us, we're a global NGO, so we fight cybercrime on the internet. So clearly I'm only 32 years old and it's been a tough gig so far. Prior to that, I was at a company called Verizon, who's big into telecoms and cyber as their CTO. And I guess throughout my life, I've always been building secure networks. So I've been on the receiving end of many attacks from international nation state attackers and, of course, ethical hackers. So people maybe like Holly trying to get into the things I was trying to defend. So yes, I guess the school of hard knocks has brought me into cyber from a basically telecoms background, I think.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Andy, and thanks everyone for just introducing yourselves there. So actually, we do have the panels. I think they are actually live, but if you could just take a moment, if you haven't already voted in the first one, because it's quite interesting for us as panelists to see, what's happening in the world out there in terms of, the practices around your IT and the practices around security. So the first poll question was, what percentage of businesses are working remotely? So because that leads into the first question I was going to ask the panel anyway, at the moment it's quite interesting because 69% are saying that they've got 50% or more of their workforce working remotely, and a further 6% have said that anyone can work remotely if they choose. Perhaps a little bit lower than I'd expected on that last one, but it's interesting to see those responses. How big an impact is this trend having, do you think, on security? I'll just ask all the panelists to chip in as they see fit, but is this a significant change from your points of view? I'll probably ask Phil actually to talk a little bit about the term from the public sector perspective first, and then Holly and Andy. But Phil, what are you seeing? Because I know you work with a lot of public sector organizations as well as private sector.
Yeah, so I think most of the public sector, where it's possible, are work from home, and this is a significant step forward for them. The technology has been there for many years, but I think this COVID has provided the catalyst to get things going. But I know this is kind of leading into your next question, but from my own perspective, I don't see home working as remote working. I see it as an extension of the office, and I think that's where we need to culturally think about this.
Absolutely. Andy?
So I think working in an office and thinking you're secure has always been a fallacy, and I know people have kind of been trained to break into physical buildings as well as computers to kind of prove that point. So in some ways, I think it's given a healthy perspective on security. I know we'll touch on it later, but I'm a big fan of the fact that this big transition, everybody's been talking about technology. I think we should talk about mental health a lot more and the human psyche. Because let's face it, cybercrime isn't computers breaking into computers. It's people breaking into computers, using computers, and probably tricking people at the other end. So I've got the builders in today while I'm doing a live broadcast. So I'm going to have a very stressful day. So in some ways, I'm simulating the scenario that everybody's experiencing. So I'm guaranteed to make a mistake either on today's panel or on the next one. And I think we've got to understand that's what's happening in everybody's workplace today.
And as you say, we'll come back to that point later on. Holly, you said you break into systems and buildings for a living, or certainly did before you became MD. What's your take on this? Are you seeing potentially a big impact on security already? Are people asking you to engage in pen testing and so on because they're worried about what their remote workers are up to?
I think there's a huge variance between companies. Some companies like ours, moving to work from home wasn't much of a change at all because we were already set up for everybody working remotely. Previously, working remotely for us meant on the road, consultants on the road, but these days, everybody working from home. It's a VPN connection. Everybody's set up and practiced how to use that system. Whereas for some organizations, I can think of one that I worked with just before the first lockdown was called, all of their staff had desktops. So it was a big thing for them to suddenly move to laptops. So they were building machines under duress. Their VPNs hadn't been tested at capacity. So they had to make some upgrades there. Again, doing that under duress, not following through great change management, those kinds of things. Hopefully a lot of companies now, having been through lockdown for so long, have addressed some of those issues. But I think a lot of companies are still considering themselves under business continuity. So they haven't doubled back to remediate those issues because they still feel like, well, working remotely isn't what they're aiming to do. They want to get back to the office. So I think it varies greatly.
That's a very interesting point, isn't it? That actually they're still in some form of triage mode or temporary operation mode and deployed to the field type mode. And at some point that will change, but we don't know when and we don't know the extent. With that in mind, though, are the specific, and I'll stay with you, Holly, for this point, are the specific security risks that are being identified here as a result of people working and to give credence to Phil's point, remotely rather than specifically from home, so just not in the main business office?
Yeah, I mean, it's going to keep coming back to that. What do you mean by working remotely point of view? Because your environment matters greatly. You know, are you working in a studio apartment where you've got 4 housemates all in the same room and you're trying to take confidential calls? Or if you look at working remotely as opposed to working from home, what environment are you in? If we have consultants on the road, they're, you know, on trains, and therefore the environment that they're in has a security impact, either having conversations or things like people overlooking
So we lost the audio there. I don't know if can you hear me, Andy?
Yeah. Good.
Okay. Could you just come in on that point, just as we lost Holly's feed there for a moment? Could you just come in on that point? What are you seeing?
I think to build on Holly's point and the distinction between remote and home. So, you know, the new buzzword in the industry is zero trust, which back to my point about once you've left the office, you should stop trusting IT systems and secure things. You know, the question is, would any of us trust a Wi-Fi hotspot in a pub or a restaurant or an airport versus our own Wi-Fi at home? So I think enabling users / staff to make sure that their home environment is as secure as it can be. And I think, again, back to, if I may say, a healthy thing about the COVID work at home scenario is it always bothered me that lots of people always did work at home, and corporates very rarely paid any attention to the security of your home network. It was almost viewed to be none of their business. And so somebody works 9 to 5 at 6 o'clock at night, they could do crazy things on the internet and endanger themselves and therefore the corporate. I think now we've got into a mind space of saying everything's a bit more 24/7, unfortunately, but actually it is the corporate's responsibility to help the user to be more secure at home. So yeah, I mean, clearly I may be an exception, but I know how secure my home router is. So there's a kind of slight trust. I think instead of zero trust, there's a minimal trust at home, and then zero trust when you're out on the road, a road warrior, as Holly mentioned.
From an architectural point of view, in how much distinction should we make between remote working and home working? Again, anyone can chip in from the panel, but I think, Phil, we've spoken about that before. In the public sector in particular, home working has tended to be associated with fixed infrastructure. Is that still the case today?
No, I don't think it is. Certainly when I was at Durham, which is now 4 years ago, but and sometime before that, we made the conscious decision to move everybody from fixed desktop to laptops, really as a business continuity issue. So everybody could move with location if we had to shut a building, etc., etc. But on the back of that, we introduced secure sort of VPN instead, dual-factor authentication, and all that, so people could effectively work from wherever they want. Can I just add, though, that my discussion with the police are saying that they're seeing really no new threats coming across the board, but a lot of existing ones revamped, reclassified, rebadged to try and catch people out.
Absolutely. Holly, are you back? As in, have you got audio?
Yeah.
Okay, excellent. Just coming back to that point, as I think you were cut off mid-flow about the new risks.
Okay.
What are you coming across, and how would you identify those risks in the current situation? So not when people go back to the office in 6 months, a year's time, or whenever it is, but right now.
I think a lot of people, certainly business leadership that I've spoken to, think that all of their staff have a similar setup to what they have. I have a nice home office with a couple of workstations and apparently not great Wi-Fi, but I'm set up here and I can work here long term. But you know, some of the team at the beginning of lockdown were balancing laptops on the washing machine because that was the only space they had.
Yeah, and that's never going to be optimal, is it? There's a point actually that was raised this morning by Andy Gold in his session. He was talking about actually the issue that, you know, businesses don't have control or visibility into home networks. We're using domestic grade Wi-Fi and domestic grade security. And the other point I think that's key is also privacy. So I'll come on to what we could do about that at the moment. But the second poll question is actually here on the screen, and it says 50% say remote working creates new security and privacy risks, and another 50% say they exist but can be mitigated. Actually, nobody has said that remote working and it's changing as I speak, actually, but nobody's actually said that there are no risks involved in remote working, which is interesting. So again, that suggests that there needs to be some sort of strategic approach to this if we're looking at this as a long-term trend. So Holly, what would you suggest people should be doing at the moment? And what can they do at the moment to control some of these risks, particularly the privacy one?
I love the idea that working from home doesn't bring in, or working remotely doesn't bring in any new security risks. I think it does for all of those businesses who have never worked remotely before. It might not be new as in a new class of vulnerability, but it might be new to that organization.
Yeah, Andy, what would you suggest that IT directors and CISOs should be looking at in terms of identifying problems and fixing them?
So I guess back to the zero trust point, obviously everybody should be having VPN two-factor authentication. I think finding ways of doing things out of band. And I think the out of band thing, meaning actually calling somebody on a mobile once in a while instead of Zoom, because it's a good way of kind of checkpointing those things. And I think back to your earlier point, when we return back to the office, I guess I beg the question, why wouldn't you make your corporate HQ just like a massive high quality internet hotel, cafe, hotspot, for example? Because the last thing you want everybody to do is suddenly decide to turn their VPN off and forget to go and turn it back on again. So again, it touches on that zero trust point. And again, I think slightly to Andy Gould's point about how can we secure the home environment. So at the risk of giving a plug for what we do, because we're a global charity, solutions out there like Quad 9, which we build, Quad 1 from Cloudflare, there are lots of free solutions which citizens and users can put on their home PC, on their smart device, and actually you could put on your home router. So I think embracing some of those solutions is a good recommendation. And again, it goes back to that blurb that if you're an IT director, and I've kind of been in that place for my sins, it is now time to be nosy and start thinking about how you help your staff and users, and in fact customers, to secure that home environment. So although you don't own it, doesn't mean you can't control it. Probably a strong word, but it also doesn't mean you can't help your staff. So I think the big word is help your staff, because they are people, they are citizens, and they're having a rough time at the moment, really. As you said, if putting aside the kind of class debate around who's got a home office and who's sat on their washing machine, it's stressful for a lot of people, and anything the IT directors can do to make those people's lives more secure by being helpful, but without being draconian, then that's got to be the way to go.
That's interesting, isn't it? So it's about advice and support as much as anything else, so rather than necessarily sort of hard physical or software-based solutions.
If you're an IT director, maybe you should be like the Citizens Advice Bureau or the Security Advice Bureau. Come and ask me for advice, as opposed to the very tell way that some things have been done. But that is a balance, obviously.
Yeah, so not saying to people, look, you just can't do this unless you've got a VPN set up or whatever. There may be some other ways of doing this. Phil, what do you think? Is that even practical, what we're talking about here?
Just while we're having this conversation, it just reminds me that I think you need to have thought about this culture of the way that you address security way back from when things were more normal. If you had a bad security culture, then it's going to be bad in the home environment. It's I think many of the principles that around making sure that what you do is safe, putting stuff away, only sharing information which is in a safe environment, being clear about who you're talking to, all these things which have really very little to do with technology, cultural issues. So if you had it bad before, then you're going to have it just as bad in the home environment. I think you need to focus on as much about the people issues rather than just the technology issues.
I was going to ask, actually, so perhaps if we move on to look at security culture in slightly more depth. No, that's absolutely fine.
Good segue.
No, it's fine. Because I just jotted that down as something we should look at. But it's an interesting thing that what you're saying is that if your cybersecurity culture is a problem in the normal world pre-COVID, it's a huge problem post-COVID or during COVID. Do the other panelists agree with that? Is that where the problem lies?
It's one of the areas, and without picking on one particular profession, but the legal profession has always had a reputation of being sloppy, for want of a better word, in terms of cybersecurity. I appreciate they've probably caught up, but yeah, I think if you've had a history of doing the same thing for the past 300 years, and then somebody just gave you technology to make it slightly more efficient, that culture is going to be pervasive. You then stir all of that up with the current COVID environment, and then it's not necessarily going to cause an immediate improvement unless we seize on some of the things, the cultural aspects we've just touched on already.
Holly, is it then a question that if a company has poor cybersecurity culture, that cybersecurity culture will just migrate over to remote working? Is that what you're seeing as a security tester?
I think the big thing to start with is define culture, right? There's a lot of organizations that I talk to, and you say, oh, how do you develop a good security culture? And they'll answer with things like, oh, we put posters on the wall. It's like, no, that's security awareness. It's not culture. That's not what we're talking about here. And if we have those organizations that don't even know where to start when it comes to culture, this idea that, what you do is who you are, then yes, absolutely, it'll transfer to home. I think a thing for people to think about is what you mentioned earlier, Stephen, of don't just tell people what to do, but tell them the why. And in some cases, as Andy mentioned earlier, it might even be taking a step back and telling them the how. So there is a great deal of don't just say use strong passwords, but explain that problem to them is a big part.
And I think if you're okay, Stephen, if I can build on Holly's point there, when you're at home, so that the TV I'm looking at is my own. I'm using my my work laptop. My router is my own. I think that self-ownership thing. This is why company cars don't exist anymore, because they got abused. So company assets do sometimes get abused. When you own the thing yourself, there's that kind of self-care, duty of care, I guess. So I think capitalizing on that maybe helps a wee bit more as well. So that's, again, an advantage, if I can say so, of the home working environment, and also blurs that kind of corporate versus staff versus citizen boundary.
Indeed, and that, yes, Phil, yes, please.
Yeah, if you don't mind if I come back here, because I think Holly's absolutely right about what do you mean by culture. And there's that old saying that a fish rots from the head downwards, and I think people look up to their C-suite for what the culture is. And if they're not being secure, if they're not adhering to good advice and guidance, then that's going to be, you're going to always struggle. So I think to create that right culture, the people who are responsible for the organization need to set the tone and set what's acceptable and what's not.
Well, certainly they have to show leadership and demonstrate good practice on their own account, don't they? There's a flip side to that as well, though. So, a few years ago, and you've alluded to this, Phil, we're talking about moving to laptops, but a few years ago, there was a big trend towards bring your own device. During the first month or so of COVID, talking to CIOs and CISOs, a lot of it was about provide access to whatever device someone can find or get hold of, which potentially raises a lot of security and compliance issues, doesn't it? Because we're talking about devices that were not designed to be used in the enterprise. They've got different logins on them. They may be shared by other members of the family or the household. They may, if you're taking some of the tablets, just not have support for multiple user accounts. How big a bump in the road was that? And what are those things? How do those things impact on the culture? So if you're saying to someone, actually, look, you can't use your personal preferred file sharing system, you have to use SharePoint or another enterprise system, which will give you an account for. Culturally, how do you persuade people that that's the right thing to do? I don't know, Phil, if you can come in on that firstly.
Yeah, I don't think there's an easy fix to that, Stephen. It's you need to work on culture time after time after time. And I would seriously question that if you didn't answer these questions during COVID, then you've kind of missed the point. These are business continuity issues which should have been thought about many times before. I don't think COVID has done anything for our business that we couldn't have expected, other than on a massive scale. Like huge millions of people now working from home. But the prospect of us all being able to, all of us not being able to access the office, all of us needing to go and work more remotely, should have been thought about in terms of the business. So I know that's a bit late, but the culture needs to have thought about that much earlier on in the cycle, I think.
Indeed. Holly, are you back?
I am indeed. I never actually left. It's just my camera turned off.
Oh, okay. Not a problem. So yeah, you caught what we were saying there then.
Yes.
What do you think?
Yeah, so the thing I wanted to point out about that, with the idea of bring your own device and using second devices or not, is partly just a mentality side of things. I don't know what you all feel about your work laptop, but I absolutely hate mine. But my own laptop, which looks very similar, is completely fine. If you're using the same device, you have kind of a mental state as to what you're doing. And some people might have a mental state of when they are working, they're conscious of security risks and those kinds of things. Whereas when they're doing their own thing, they care less about privacy, security, those kinds of things. But if it is the same device, there might be some blurring there. Maybe somebody will check their personal email on their work device and things like that, which might be a corporate policy violation. But if that line is blurred, we get issues like that. So it's just something that needs consideration more than it being a problem.
And things like pre-existing applications that you have on your device as well that might, I'm not going to call out any particular vendors because they all do it to some extent, but synchronizing with the cloud or synchronizing between devices. As soon as you drop into that mode and have a file that's being stored, that file may be stored in a non-compliant way. And if that contains customer data, health data, or any of those things, potentially you've got a problem going forward, haven't you? So when somebody starts to look at this in a few months' time or next year, that could be an issue.
Can I just say that cybersecurity is only one of the risks that clearly that business have had to address. And so I think the business needs to weigh up, look, if it's a question of do we go out of business or do we use somebody's a device that I can't identify whether it's secure or not, that's a fairly easy decision. We need to keep going. And I think so some balance needs to be made, I think, in terms of the risks that are faced with. And again, that's the responsibility of good governance, is what's the risk, how do we balance that, what's the mitigation, and overall, what have we decided?
That's absolutely spot on, because it's about the risk appetite of the business and, of course, the constraints that their regulators, if they're in a regulated industry, imposes upon them. And so, I don't know if there's been anything said officially, but I think regulators certainly mostly in Europe, are taking a reasonably light touch approach to compliance at the moment, because they appreciate that businesses have had to move rapidly, but that might tighten up. And certainly, I spoke to one CISO who said, look, it's fairly simple, keep a list, in a notebook, on an Excel spreadsheet, of the things that you've done or allowed people to do. And then when times return to some semblance of normality, we can start to triage those, and we can divide them into three. Things we can keep, they're fine. Things that can be kept and perhaps are worth keeping because they're valuable, but maybe they need some additional security, such as encryption rules or additional security culture, additional processes around that. So you only store certain grades of information on there, and things that we absolutely need to get rid of. And I think that makes a lot of sense. But what does the panel think? Is that a sensible approach in how do we tie that into what we've done so far?
Can I jump in on that one?
You may, absolutely, please.
Yeah, absolutely. Companies should prepare to violate their own processes and policies. Companies might have something like, we install all patches after 14 days, after a rigorous testing process, and then some critical issue, think of 2014 Heartbleed, those kinds of issues. Some critical issue might come up that needs remediating immediately. The company shouldn't forget that they did that. They should have some way of documenting that. Oh, we need to send everybody home because there's a global pandemic and we have done these actions that are against our standard processes. We should track that. How you track that, I don't really care, but change management and risk registers, those are things that exist. You could put within that change management that this was an emergency change and it should be revisited. You should also write when it should be revisited, otherwise it will continue to say revisited in the future.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, that's what the thing
we all talk about lessons learned, and we sit down but very rarely do we actually learn the lessons. We just list the things that we've done. And I think Holly's point is absolutely right. Document them in whatever you want, but make sure that you do set a time to go back and revisit them.
And I think, to build on that point, if I can, we're probably all great fans. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. There's many things to do in the world of IT and cyber, but that also means there's many sacred cows that exist. So the amount of times I've been told in other organizations, the business wouldn't like that, or the business wouldn't let us change that. And I hate the phrase the business, because it's actually some people somewhere. But again, the COVID experience has made us just go and break some of those rules and kind of start again. So exactly what everybody's said already, that some of those things probably were good changes and we didn't need to do that thing anyway, but it's just being aware of that, as opposed to let's just go back to the previous state and not make those evaluations.
And interestingly, some of those things, we did change them, we did break them, and the wheels didn't come off, and we can keep those, which is good, actually. So some businesses have suffered, and of course, we're all very much aware of that, but others have actually gained new flexibility from this. So it hasn't necessarily all been from a security point of view, it's not all been a bad experience.
Yeah, I think, to add to that, if I can quickly, the human condition is scared of change and is scared of the unknown. So this has forced us into the unknown in some cases.
But then coming back to the point about security culture and our final poll result here, which is quite interesting, we've got a split. I'm just going to bring this over on my screen so I can call up the results. But we've seen, for example, I've got 4 questions here. So have you adopted your security awareness programs for remote working? And the options were no, not yet, but we plan to, yes, or we already included it. So very interesting split there. 8% haven't done it. 33% haven't made any changes but plan to. 33 have not made changes but plan to. 38% have made changes, and 21% already include remote working in their cyber culture programs. So what type of initiatives could we undertake as organizations to improve the way that the human side of security works better in a remote environment? And in particularly an environment where, for example, you can't just go around and give people informal advice or even point to the poster on the wall, coming back to Holly's example earlier on. I don't know if Andy, if you want to pick that one initially, or Phil, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I think I'll go back to what I started before. I think that those people who are responsible for the organization or take a leadership role need to lead, and they need to set by example. They need to demonstrate how they apply secure practices wherever they are. Personally, I don't think there's necessarily a difference between remote working and office working. It's just you're doing the same thing, just in a different place. And so you need to be clear about what those practices are, and those who people look up to need to implement them and pick up on any bad behavior.
Yeah, and to echo that and to pick up on Phil's point, there's a lot of debate and difference between the word leadership and management. And I think management in an organization and leadership is what we need now, not just within IT. So I think, we touched on the psychology, mental health point earlier, but checking in with people, seeing how they are, blah, 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 is all part of good leadership and management. And then, by the way, that involves a cybersecurity angle. But again, if everybody's teams, regardless of whether you work in cyber, IT, finance department, sales, etc., if everybody's stressed out, criminals will take advantage of that. Everybody waits for people to make mistakes in the same way that hackers look for vulnerabilities in software. So anything people can do in these stressed out times to make sure that people's psyche is in the right place. And that's all about good corporate leadership across the board and across the disciplines.
What surprises me the most from that poll is not organizations saying they haven't yet made changes but plan to. Companies are slow, I understand that. It's organizations who answer that question with, oh no, we already had that problem solved. Your organization already had security awareness training that covers a global pandemic lasting longer than a year. I don't believe you.
I don't think I believe them either. Why though let's unpick that a little bit though, because we've got a couple of minutes left. Why would something that you'd written before COVID not necessarily work now, Holly?
I think that the most direct point I could point to is what I mentioned earlier of not everybody in the business understanding the context that other people are working on.
I think you've gone there. I don't know if Phil or Andy, you want to just chip in on that point of what areas of security culture.
There we go.
Oh, you're back.
Sorry.
Okay. Carry on,
I am, sorry. Zoom hanging. What I was pointing to earlier with not everybody in the business understanding other people's contexts. So you might not realize that other people share a house with housemates and things like that, and that has an impact. If you have a studio apartment with 4 housemates, you might not be able to take confidential calls. You might not be able to have classified documents at home. It just might not physically be possible. You might trust your housemates, but the business might not, and they might not have had appropriate background checks.
Can I just come in here, because I absolutely agree with Holly, and I think the first thing that people need to do when they're faced with some sort of business continuity incident is to get a group of people together and say, okay, what is happening? What are the consequences of this? And which issues can we address straight away? Which issues are more problematical? And so I think you can foresee many of these actions, you can plan for them, but when it comes to the crunch time, then you really need to sit down and revisit that, because no disaster is exactly the same as the previous one.
Andy, could you just add to that?
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, Holly's used language there, such as classified documents, which, those of us who've been in the kind of government world are probably very used to. But I think it does, again, allow us to address some of those sacred cows. There would have been rules that say you can't have a classified document in a room with a basement flat without bars on the windows, let's say. But now necessity says, well, you can't come into the office, so you've got to work your way around it. So, necessity is the mother of invention. So I think it drives those things. But it therefore goes back to any plan that survives contact with the enemy doesn't exist, frankly. So yeah, we have had a big situation. So nothing's ever going to be 100%, and it goes back to that. How do you learn from that? Because there will be a COVID-20, or there'll be something else happen. The power will go off in London, or some other thing. No disaster recovery plan's ever 100%, and it's as Phil said, getting with people who you trust, who you can work with, working it through. I nearly said muddling it through, but again, some of those sacred cows have to go out of the window.
Yeah, and no plan is any good unless you test it, which again is another issue that's harder to do in an environment where people are remote. So again, it's about mindset, isn't it? And we touched on that question of mental health, Phil. So I'll just remind people, by the way, please do put your questions in the chat if you want me to pose them to the panel. But on that point about mental health, if people are under stress, they're much more likely to make mistakes, but they're also more vulnerable in other ways. They may be more willing to be duped or more able to be manipulated by bad actors. Is that a factor that security culture needs to take into account, do you think, Andy?
Yeah, absolutely. Or they could be on furlough, or they could be worried about their job. And bribery is obviously a big index, or their manager isn't a great manager or leader, so they're just feeling particularly annoyed that they didn't ask if they're living in a shared flat with 4 people and that their day's been very stressful. So yeah, absolutely. I think there's a whole load of, as we said earlier, there are no new crimes as a result of COVID, but the opportunity to go and exploit some of those actually old techniques and bring them down and dust them down from the criminal community are absolutely there. Yeah.
Well, that's aside from selling fake masks or whatever it might
Yeah.
be. Yeah. Phil, does that resonate with you?
Yeah, I think picking up on Andy's point, I think there are no new management techniques. Managing remote people is the same as managing people next to you. You need to communicate with them. You need to converse with them. You need to check that they're okay, to make sure that they're on track. They understand what the business is trying to do. So I think that should be the case. But people, I think, I find it quite difficult to manage remote people. And so what they need to do is to get back and think about their management processes and make sure they do make that contact, make sure the regular contact, even just for people's well-being, just to make sure that they're okay and functioning properly.
Holly, if there was one thing that you would do in security culture to improve it for remote workers, what would it be?
I think from the business's point of view, it would be knowing that social engineering is more than tricking staff. Andy pointed out bribery is covered under social engineering. Organizations should adjust for risk for that. For staff members, who was taking the point of view of how do I make everybody a little happier, I think Phil nailed it. A big part of it is contact with the business and knowing that the way things are, it's affecting everybody and considering the mental health side of things. That's what I do. I would encourage all businesses to talk to their team and say, okay, which one of you needs us to send you a monitor and a chair because you're currently balanced on your washing machine?
Thank you. We've got a couple of questions. One is, how blind are we to our wireless network airspace? I guess that means the risks inherent in using domestic Wi-Fi. Does anyone want to comment on that?
I think it's easily fixable. Sorry, Holly. Go on.
Oh, yeah. Domestic Wi-Fi is not great from a security point of view. It's not an insurmountable problem, and I think anyone who works in IT has probably made those changes already to use non-default, long, non-deterministic passwords on their Wi-Fi, or maybe something cool like enterprise-grade Wi-Fi. Most people haven't, and cracking passwords is really quick now thanks to cloud computing.
No, absolutely. And there was another question. So I'm just trying to bring it up here about the security of online payments and the cashless society post-COVID. Are there any specific risks around, so it says credit card payments? I'm not sure exactly how that pertains to remote working, but let's just try it anyway. Does moving to a cashless setup actually pose new risks to us from a security perspective?
I think remarkably, that's one of the infrastructures that survived really well and has just embraced the change. And I think the banks have done really well in that space. There's a bit of a debate I was in recently about are there infrastructure issues or resilience issues in there, but I think it's been really well stress tested. So I think that's to me, that's an example of I would rather do things cashless and online than carry about 200 quid in my back pocket and get mugged one night, let's say. So again, move from physical security to a positive online security stance.
Or indeed pick up COVID from banknotes, which apparently is possible. Yeah, okay. I mean, we're running towards the end of our allotted time now, unfortunately, and that's been a very informative session. So unless anyone does have a final question they want to pop in the chat box, I'll probably just ask our panel to summarize it, if that's okay. Again, I'm just looking forward, hoping that we'll move back to normality. Are there any particular security steps, and please keep this brief so we keep to time, but any particular security steps that we need to take as we move back to normal business as usual, if that's possible? Stay with you, Andy, just quickly.
I've said it already, but I think keep treating your staff and colleagues as users and citizens, and anything you can do to help them to be pervasively secure across their own devices, their work devices, and therefore get them thinking about this stuff is right. Because if people aren't thinking about security, you can't force it on them.
Okay, Phil?
Yeah, I just go back to the point. I don't think there's such thing as a home working, remote working, or office working. There's just work, and you need to have a culture that is secure for wherever you happen to be working.
And Holly, what would you say just to conclude?
Don't think that VPNs solve all of the problems of being on a compromised network. If that network is shared with compromised devices and trusted devices, then VPNs don't solve all of those problems, and you should probably do a security review.
Okay, thank you very much. So thank you very much for those insights. It's been a very interesting conversation, and certainly I've learned things from it, and hopefully the audience has too. Apologies if we didn't get around to answering all of your questions, but especially thank you for participating in the polls as well, because that's very useful to us to see how things are working on the ground. That was all for this session. I hope you can stay around for the rest of today's agenda. We have some sessions on cybersecurity in the cloud, which is a big issue, and also building resilience in the NHS. So I look forward to those. That, though, is all for me. Thanks again to our panel, and thank you very much for watching. And I will hand back over to Kerry for some final housekeeping. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys. That was fantastic. I learned some new stuff, thought about some new things. Really, really great. Expertly led there by Stephen. So that is the end of this session. We've got our next session starting in around 5 minutes. So that is with my colleague Mark Lomas, who is solution architect at ProBrand, and that's tackling the security implications of a cloud-first approach. So please head onto your agenda and click through to see that. Thank you again for tuning in, and thanks, enormous thanks to all of our panelists today. Okay, thanks. See you in the next session. Bye.
Thanks again, everyone.